Hi, Dan Aker, Director of Operations at the Ontario Regiment Museum. We've had a lot of questions from various people coming in about how anti-tank munitions work. And so I was asked to just give a quick primer on how some of these different weapons have an effect, different munitions have an effect on armor. So the most common one that you're going to hear of recently is anti-tank missiles. Anti-tank missiles, like RPGs, like missiles themselves, that's, RPG is an anti-tank rocket. A lot of them work on what is known as a high explosive anti-tank principle or heat principle. And most, RPGs and rockets and bazooka shells, this is a 106 millimeter dummy round, for a recoilless rifle. Most of those shells have got this weird shape, and that's because the way it works is that you have here high explosives roughly in this area of the munition, and you have a metal triangular liner that goes into it. And the fuse is up here, and this basically is just a spacer between the fuse and the explosives. What happens is the fuse initiates and it sets off the explosive. Now the liner, which is in here, could be copper, could be another metal, but basically what it does is the explosion is focused on a very inwards force because of the triangular shape. And basically what it kind of does is it liquefies the metal, which then basically burns a hole through the armor and splatters inside the vehicle, spraying incredibly hot liquid metal around, where if it hits anything that is squishy, i.e. human, or explosive, i.e. fuel or ammunition, it has catastrophic effects. Now, what has happened is that you'll notice a lot of tanks tend to have little blocks on the outside of their armor now, and that's what's known as explosive reactive armor. And that's a concept that was developed years ago. And what it is there are little metal boxes with explosives inside it. And so when this hot jet goes against it, the explosive within the box explodes and can disrupt the warhead, the heat jet, both by having a counter explosion and also by pushing a metal piece towards it and upwards, which means that most of the jet is being used to cut that rather than the major part of the armor. So that's one way of defeating it. You'll see that a number of vehicles have got bars, metal bars, either on the sides of the vehicle or some now on the tops of the vehicle, because when this warhead comes in, if it gets squished or it either detonates against the metal or it gets deformed, it renders the missile or the warhead and the way that the heat round works, it makes it less effective. So that's another thing that works. And of course, the counter to having explosive and reactive armor is to have a two-stage warhead where it's got, the first one goes in, this would have basically two stages. The first one would go in and set off the reactive armor, and the reactive armor would make that useless, and then all of a sudden the second charge comes in and goes through the hole in the reactive armor that is now open because of the first charge. So that's sort of how heat rounds work, and so that's what you'll find with RPGs, that's what you'll find with a lot of anti-tank missiles, and you can actually fire it from tank guns. The next way of doing something is something called HESH. It's not very popular anymore, but what it is it's a round that goes through the air, and the Americans call it HEP, which is high explosive plastique. And that goes through the air and it slams into the side of the vehicle. It is not dependent on speed. The HEP round hits the outside of the vehicle, It is basically plastic explosive. The fuse is at the back. It forms a pancake on the outside of the armor. The fuse hits, and it is the equivalent of taking a very large sledgehammer and hitting it on the outside of the armor, and bits of the metal on the inside, the armor on the inside, will flake away and will zip around the interior of the vehicle, hopefully harming the crew and or perhaps setting off, destroying equipment, maybe setting off or destroying armor within the vehicle. That is usually dealt with now again by having some form of spacing, but also in terms of having Kevlar liners within the vehicle or other liners within the vehicle that will absorb most of the small fragments that come shooting around that might be knocked off. Also, again, having different layers of armor will also reduce the effect of that weapon. Now, the best killer of tanks is a high velocity kinetic energy penetrator. So this is based sort of on two principles. In order to have the maximum velocity coming out, you have to have a wider shell. As the penetrators, as the projectile increased in size, the shell had to increase in size. The problem was that, so the wider the shell, the more powder behind it to push it, or propellant to push it, meant that you had a wider projectile, because the two had to match somehow. But that wider projectile would lose velocity quicker than a smaller projectile. So basically, if you think about two pieces of metal, one shaped like a coin and one shaped like a needle, if they're both going at the same velocity against a piece of wood, the piece that's shaped like a coin will not go too deep, whereas the piece that's shaped like a needle will go through, although they weigh the same amount and they are both going at the same velocity. The narrower penetrator tends to focus more energy to allow for penetration. So what we do is we have a shell that is that wide. It goes bang. The munition goes down, the warhead goes down, and basically as it exits the barrel, this piece, okay, the Sabo, basically breaks away. So all the energy is focused on a Sabo being a French word for shoe. So the shoe leaves, and so all the energy of the larger shell is now focused behind basically a needle that is usually done of tungsten or depleted uranium or some other incredibly dense substance, which goes through and makes a hole and ruins lives and obliterates futures for tank crewmen who are usually hit with these types of weapons. So we've talked about heat, high explosive anti-tank favored by slower rounds, rockets and bazookas. We've talked about Sabo. There is plain old anti-tank, which nobody really works with too much anymore because Sabo does the job. There's also something called HESH, or HEP, as I said, which is the plastic explosive. Those are the main kinds of rounds that are used by different types of penetration of tanks. I hope this has been not terribly boring. Thank you.